Well, hello, everybody. How's everyone doing? Happy Monday to everyone. Kat, John, Tay. Yeah, hope everyone's doing well also. Well, hopefully you saw my little message in the email that today is a lecture that a lot of people really enjoy. Hey, Dominic. Hey, Janelle. Um, it's I think it's enjoyable for a number of reasons. One, just like some of the other stuff we've kind of talked about in class, it doesn't really come up very often. And typically, when it does, it becomes maybe a little bit judgy. And I think William James does a pretty exceptional job of steering clear of that, in my opinion. So I guess I will be brave and ask who took the time to do the reading. So, like I said, it was just a little blog post, so it wasn't very hard. But I know some of you have other things on your mind, got other stuff going on, didn't have time, didn't care, etc., etc. So, who actually read? I'm curious. This would be better if there were more people, you know, up my chances of being happy. Not yet. Okay, I respect that. Anyone else? I think after we go over it today, it'll be hard to skip reading this one. For one, like I've said before, James is probably one of the better writers that we'll read. He's very engaging, gives very good examples. He tends to find really to stumble on like really surprising kind of topics and stuff like that. So I think he's really good for a number of reasons. But anyway, I don't want to jump into this too terribly quickly because, like I said, I want people to have time to really soak it up. So let's take a couple of minutes just to kind of check in with one another. Wednesday is the last lecture of the class, by the way. It's going to be on Freud and Freud's kind of philosophical writings, not his psychoanalysis stuff. So I think the excerpt for Wednesday is from Civilization and Its Discontents, which in my opinion is Freud's best work. I mean, I don't agree with a lot of the stuff that he says, but I find it extremely humorous, and he does have some pretty amazing insights about how groups work and how civilization works. And in fact, I know a lot of people here, and I've told you in class before, that Freud is kind of fallen out of favor, and people think that he's just a crazy dude. But in fact, Freud is kind of making his way back as a cultural theorist, and the biggest book that is being kind of pulled into the forefront of academia, especially in like culture studies right now, is Civilization and Its Discontents. So I think we're gonna read part of what is bringing Freud back. So I think that's cool. Okay. Aside from that, I don't want to completely drop off the grid, but it looks like Friday I'm giving you a day to work on your nation states project. I know for some of you you're already done, which means you get a free day. And then next week I think I have a movie lined up for you if I'm not mistaken. So I'm not going to tell you what movie it is, but I will put it in a folder on Blackboard. It will be able to be streamed through the UTSA library, so you don't have to buy it. You don't have to have any kind of subscription. And I think the movie is, one, it's a really good movie, and two, I think it's kind of emblematic of what your journey in AIS is like. When I was thinking of what kinds of movies to show, this is just one of my favorite movies in general. But what kind of shocks me is how the kinds of topics that we covered in here, purpose, meaning, truth, subjectivity. Are we responsible for our actions? Are we just the product of a group? If we say we're just the product of the group, on what grounds do we make this argument? All these kind of really deep, profound existential topics are all built into this particular movie. So I think it's a really good one. I think students in general tend to like it. Now, I will say on the record that I'm a little disappointed that we don't get to watch it in class together, because in class, the way the movie works out is like after the first 50 minutes, I mean, it's just awful. And then 50 minutes later, it might be even worse. And then, things start to kind of get better in the end. But yeah, so you getting to sit down and watch the whole thing in one day, well, I don't get the immense joy of watching the narrative arc really mess with y'all. But that's okay. I can imagine that, when you sit down to watch the movie, that you'll get something out of it. Now, I also want to say for the record that the test is will include questions about the movie. So the movie is not just like some fun, goofy thing, even though it is meant to be an opportunity to just kind of relax and reflect on the class. But more than that, it's testable questions. Somewhere between 5 and 7 questions on the test will be drawn from the movie itself. So please don't forget to do that. Okay. Well, I've waited 6 minutes, and I was thinking, we'd end up with like 20 people or whatever, but alas, other people have stuff going on, so they'll have to watch it on their own, I suppose. Okay, so the background on this. Now, you remember that last week we read James, then we read Goffman, then we read Du Bois, and then and now we're reading James again. Go ahead, John. You got a question? Can y'all read this? I think it might be backwards for y'all, but it says Jedi Knight. We're waiting for a question in case you're curious. I know we've been on quarantine for a while. Am I the only person who like misses the like things that you don't really think about? Like, I miss getting my hair cut. My hair is just getting really long. Yeah, Dominic, you need this cup. It's actually from the Disney store, so I bet you can probably find it. Okay. Other than reflection 3 and the final reflection in the exam, what else will we be doing for the class? Just the nation states project, I believe. I think it's just those couple of things. Yeah, Kaylee. I mean, my wife's saying like, she misses getting her nails done. I'm like, I need a haircut. It's just so many like little things, that are part of the day that we don't necessarily spend a lot of time thinking about, and those things being gone is just kind of like meh. Anyway, I have been learning to take better care of my beard on my own, though. So, pros and cons. Okay, so actually, hold on. Let me get the syllabus. I don't want to tell you something wrong. Okay. All right, I'm back. So, yeah, reflection 3 is due this coming Sunday, and it will be over your favorite lecture from the 2 James lectures, Goffman, Du Bois, and Freud. So fewer choices, but these topics tend to be the ones that interest students more anyway. Yeah, John, I'm sure your beard is getting long. It's like really crazy. And, getting this nice beard growth is all wonderful and everything, but then you have to make it look nice, and that's this whole other problem. Okay. Yeah, it looks like next week I've allocated Monday and Wednesday to watch a movie, and then next Friday is the exam. And then the nation states worksheet is due May 4th, and then the final reflection is going to be due May 8th. So this revised syllabus is actually on Blackboard right now. And I also want to say, just as a reminder, so one thing that we kind of talked about in class was future research projects. What kinds of things can social science study? What kinds of things has social science maybe turned its back on that could be interesting to study? And so the final reflection that you'll be doing in this class, I'm hoping is going to form the basis for a new research project, and perhaps some of you can be involved in that going forward. I don't know exactly what that will look like yet. I have to talk to some of my colleagues who are better researchers than myself in terms of like getting the right clearances. But it should be a good launching point, if nothing else. So that research project, this reflection is kind of loosely being called the Remembrance Project, and the topic of it is like it sounds. How do you want to be remembered? What parts of your life are the parts of your life that you're most attached to? What parts of your sense of self and your sense of competence and of achievement and your sense of goodness and your sense of shame, what parts of yourself are so stick out in your mind, and do you consider to be especially emblematic of like who you are? So it's a reflection about that. Obviously it's meant to be extremely deep, and so I would encourage you to spend some time thinking about it before you actually start writing. But yeah, I'll be the only one reading them, so of course, say whatever you want to say, and we'll go from there. Yeah, the other thing is sometimes if you put things in reflections that are so to not triggering or whatever for me, but that the university is concerned about, I'm required to report those things to BIT, which is the Behavioral Intervention Team, and that's basically just to keep an eye on you, not not in like a Big Brother fashion, but in the sense that they're just going to reach out to you and check and see if you need anything. And so this is things like, if you're having like difficulties at home, like if you're having problems with kind of domestic violence or food security, home security, those kinds of things. You talk about suicide, those kinds of things. I'm required, sexual assault, those kinds of things I'm required to report. So I'm saying, you can say whatever you want, and that's just in the spirit of, because we have our classroom ethic. But I am just letting you know for the record that there are certain things that I'm required to report. So, yeah, it's not that big of a deal, and it doesn't go on your permanent record, from what I understand. So, yeah, that's. But anyway, the final reflection isn't really about any of those things. It's about, who are you and what is important to you and who do you want to become and what's that going to look like. So it should be really good. Yes, a lot of people I imagine, have very high anxiety right now, given the huge changes, and also probably developing quite the alcohol tolerance, because, when you sit at home and you don't have to drive a vehicle all day or do dentistry or whatever, you can make decisions like that. Of course, today is 420, so that's all I'm going to say about that. So you're so long. Okay. Okay, so I know some of y'all are at work, got other things going on. So this has been a long enough kind of expedited intro. Yeah, let's just get right to the James stuff, because I think this is the really, really interesting reading. So let me remind you, last week we did James, then we did Goffman, then we did Du Bois. And I told you that Goffman uses the analogy of the stage, and then James uses the discussion of the self, right? And he had the different kinds of selves. You had the material self, the spiritual self, the social self, and then the pure ego, okay? And then Du Bois borrows from that, and he builds his idea of the veil and the sense of double consciousness and what that's like and how that operates, and kind of walking a fine line between a lot of different parts of academia that have developed since he wrote it, and Du Bois was kind of trailblazing in between them. Okay, so James, like I told you before, he is the quintessential sick soul. Okay, this is the pessimist for pessimists. If you're a pessimistic person, if you're someone who tends to kind of not look on the bright side, then James is your guy. For one, he comes across, very, very thorough. He's certainly pragmatic. He's very interested in like what works, but he's also deeply concerned with the highs and lows of life. And no work in his corpus better exemplifies that than the varieties of religious experience. And that's where today's reading comes from. This is a chapter or a portion of one of the chapters in that book, and he's dealing with what the difference is between being a sick soul and being healthy-minded. But before we get into that, I want to actually read you something from the thing I sent you, because I think it's just really amazing. So, all right. Let's see. Okay. So the author kind of begins by summarizing. He says, "We've all known or met people who seem happy all the time, who are convinced of the essential goodness of life, who radiate a certain enthusiasm and cheer. They seem almost to have come out of the womb with a bottle of champagne in their hands. Sometimes they even seem blind to the darker sides of life, to disease, hardship, vices, venality, sin. Instinctively, they give others the benefit of the doubt, see the positive and beautiful in everything, and are incapable of censoriousness." So, and then he says, "There are those, on the other hand, who are painfully conscious of evil in the world. They tend to be discontented, alienated, divided. They long for a point and purpose in life, but cannot find one. They are given to despair and yearn for nothing so much as deliverance from a fallen and transient world. So James draws this kind of dichotomy between being healthy-minded and being sick-souled. But he also wants to note that in both of those two different categories, there's a spectrum. There's kind of an extreme healthy-mindedness where you cannot see anything wrong with the world, and there's kind of an extreme sick soul where there's absolutely nothing good in life. Everything is just horrible and dark and evil and unredeemable. So you've got the spectrum in both of them. Now, before I go any further, James is very clear. Being healthy-minded does not make you good any more than being sick-souled makes you bad. And being sick-souled does not make you good any more than being healthy-minded makes you bad. He thinks that being healthy-minded is a way to live a more fulfilling life, but he seems to think that being sick-souled gives you a deeper insight into the human condition. And of course, we have to ask the question, is his view about this because he was a sick soul, right? Does James settle on the sick-souled being the real intelligence behind and really understanding human experience because he was sick-souled, or does he think they have a better understanding of kind of human reality because they take more things into account? I think James would call that a live question. But also we need to be careful that we don't just say that James thought this because of this or because of that. He has to be able to hold the position that he does on his own terms. If we can explain away his reasoning, then we don't have to take him seriously. And James would say that's not the right way to approach him, and that's not the right way to approach anyone, because, of course, we want our ideas to be taken seriously, not just as a product of our environment, where we just say, well, you think that, but that's because you're X, Y, Z, whatever. So this is kind of taking a step back from who is speaking and focusing on what is being said, if you want to look at it that way. Okay. So he talks about mystics, saints, converts, ascetics, even people in insane asylums. I mean, this is just unbelievable stuff. So he starts with calling people like Walt Whitman and Ralph Waldo Emerson as being healthy-minded, along with certain liberal preachers. Okay, and he gives an example from Everett Hale, and Everett Hale writes, "I can remember perfectly that when I was coming to manhood, the half-philosophical novels of the time had a deal to say about the young men and maidens who were facing the problem of life. I had no idea what the problem of life was. To live with all my might seemed to me easy. To learn where there was so much to learn seemed pleasant and almost, of course, to lend a hand. If one had a chance, natural. And if one did this, why? He enjoyed life because he could not help it, and without proving to himself that he ought to enjoy it." So the healthy-minded person just sees being happy as very natural, sees just engaging with the world as a simple means of being happy, of being fulfilled, and also to not dwell too much on things, to live. Nowadays we would call it being mindful or being present, because when we're being present, we are not preoccupied with how life is supposed to be or what it could be, and we are not focused on how it has been. So this is partly why James thinks a healthy-minded person leads a more fulfilling life, because they are able to live in the present. And he thinks that the sick soul struggles with this, and he has good reason for thinking so. Okay, let's keep going. All right. So James says, "One can but recognize in such rioters as these the presence of of the temperament organically weighted on the side of cheer and fatally forbidden to linger, as those of opposite temperament linger over the darker aspects of the universe." Okay, here it is. So James thought Luther and Tolstoy, so this is Martin Luther, the head of the Protestant Reformation, and Tolstoy, who wrote War and Peace, who's considered the greatest author, maybe one of the greatest authors of the entire 19th century, and certainly one of the best authors within the Western canon. He wrote, like I said, War and Peace, among other books as well. So it's like him and Dostoevsky are probably the two giants of Russian literature. Okay, so James thought Luther and Tolstoy had personified the sick soul, to which category one might add aspects of Stoicism and Epicureanism. These are Roman philosophies. The pessimism of Schopenhauer's philosophy, the fire and brimstone theology of Jonathan Edwards, and the spiritual longings of someone like Hermann Hesse. James recognized that there are degrees and gradations of sickness, as there are degrees and gradations of healthy-mindedness. In Melancholics, he knows, and Melancholics is the old term for depressed people. So you suffer from melancholy, that's suffering from depression. So again, in Melancholics, he notes, the world now looks remote, strange, sinister, uncanny. Its color is gone, its breath is cold, there's no speculation in the eyes it glares with. It is as if I lived in another century, says one asylum patient. I see everything through a cloud, says another. Does that sound familiar? Things are not as they were, and I am changed. I see, says a third. I touch, but the things do not come near me. A thick veil alters the hue and look of everything. Persons move like shadows, and sounds seem to come from a distant world. There is no longer any past for me. People appear so strange. It is as if I could see, it is as if I could not see any reality, as if I were in a theater. Okay, so again, amazing right there. I mean, I told you that James was influential in Du Bois's writing, but right there we have that exact reference to seeing life again, like through a curtain, and then another person calls it through a veil. And of course, Du Bois's writing was double consciousness and the veil. So since we have the spectrum that you can be, not only the spectrum between being healthy-minded and sick-souled, but you have the spectrum of being healthy-minded and the spectrum of being sick-souled. So let's take some of the people that we've talked about before. Marx, who seems to say that all, or doesn't seem, he says blatantly that the entire history of the world is a history of class struggle. That's an immensely pessimistic way of looking at the world. But Marx also thinks that history is on basically railroad tracks, and that eventually we are going to go from capitalism to from capitalism to socialism, and socialism to communism, and that once we are in communism, that human nature will change, and we will be able to finally be happy, and we will be able to be free. Now that is extremely pessimistic point. Okay, so Marx kind of ties together healthy-minded and sick-souled, but at the end of the day, Marx is healthy-minded. Now let's take Durkheim. Durkheim, who talks about things that we are very familiar with: family, with society, with organizations, with clubs, with religion, and he's talking about all these different things that we are connected with, and we would say, oh, these are healthy-minded things. But at the end of the day, Durkheim talks about how human existence was full of suffering, full of malaise, full of pain, full of torment, and how when our desires continue to grow and to change, and when there's nothing to check them, what we end up with is an inextinguishable thirst. Okay, and whenever you get thirsty, right, you like to drink water. But imagine if like you kept getting thirsty and you could never find enough liquid to satiate your thirst. Durkheim says when there aren't checks on our desires, then it's like having a thirst that's completely out of control. We are bound to be unhappy. So Durkheim, at the end of the day, is definitely a sick soul. And then we got people like Weber. Weber, super sick soul, right? Bureaucracy is an iron cage. Modernity is an iron cage. Very sick soul. I would say Zimmel is probably a sick soul too, although he kind of treads the line between them, because Zimmel thinks about life as having kind of creative energy and how we're able to tap into that. And again, he's always interested in the dialectic. So a stranger is near and far at the same time. That gives them kind of a certain special place within society. So let's say Zimmel probably ends up narrowly on the side of healthy-minded. You can make an argument that he ends up narrowly on the side of sick-souled, I suppose. Anyway, Du Bois ends up being sick-souled. Again, that quote about the veil, basically Du Bois. Goffman, I would say at the end of the day, is extremely healthy-minded, because even though he talks about how life is nothing but a stage and we're all performers trying to convince other people that our performance is genuine, he doesn't see this as making us less moral. He seems to think that everything that we do is about being moral. And so I think that's ultimately a pretty healthy-minded way to look at things. And then Freud, if anyone was ever a pessimist, it was definitely Freud. So a lot of people that we're going to read about are sick souls, but they're on different versions of the spectrum. So I would say probably the most sick-souled out of all of them is Freud, and then it's like probably Durkheim, and then Weber, and then maybe, let me think about this. Yeah, Freud, Durkheim, probably James, then Weber, Zimmel. No, Weber, Du Bois, Zimmel, Marx. Yeah, that sounds right. Okay. Anyway, Not that it matters putting them in an order, but just kind of giving you an idea of the way that the different thinkers kind of we could arrange them on a spectrum. All right, let's dig more into this. I mean, some of these quotes are just like unbelievable. Okay, so the first thing is he's going to talk about healthy mindedness, and he's got several just like really amazing paragraphs in here. So I'm going to read a handful of them and give you some examples. He says, in many persons, happiness is congenital and irreclaimable. Cosmic emotion inevitably takes in the form of enthusiasm and freedom. I speak not only of those who are animally happy, I mean those who, when unhappiness is offered or proposed them, positively refuse to feel it, as if it were something mean and wrong. We find such persons in every age, passionately flinging themselves upon the sense of goodness of life, in spite of the hardships of their own condition, and in spite of the sinister theologies into which they may be born. From the outset, their religion is one of union with the divine. St. Francis and his immediate disciples were, on the whole, of this company of spirits, of which there are, of course, infinite varieties, again, the spectrum. Rousseau, in the earlier years of his writing, Diderot, St. Pierre, and many of the leaders of the 18th century anti-Christian movement were of this optimistic type. They owed their influence to a certain authoritativeness in their feeling that nature, if you will only trust her sufficiently, is absolutely good. So it's a pretty optimistic mindset, right? That the kind of social reality and the society that we live in has all sorts of problems, and that if we could just live closer to nature, if we could live without all of the kinds of problems and constraints that society puts on us, that we could actually be happy, and we would also live more in communion with one another and more in communion with nature. And he gives the example of St. Francis of Assisi. If you don't know, St. Francis was born the son of a wealthy merchant, and so he was basically very well off, and he was set up to kind of go into that merchant class as well, and to take up that same post. But he gives away all of his money, he gives away his inheritance, and he goes and he wears like a nice kind of simple monk cloak, and he goes and he lives out in the woods. And eventually other people come to pray with him, and of course eventually it becomes a religious order within the Catholic Church, the Franciscans. So it's an order very, very much based on poverty of bodily poverty, but richness of the spirit and a rich life. And so how do you live a rich life? Well, St. Francis and the other healthy-minded people would say you basically take away these external distractions, right? The material distractions, and instead you focus on what is right in front of you and being grateful for it. So there you go. Okay, let's keep going. Oh yeah, this one's good. He says, it is to be hoped that we all have some friend, perhaps more often feminine than masculine, and young than old, whose soul is of the sky blue tint, whose affinities are rather with flowers and birds and all enchanting innocencies, like innocences, than with dark human passions, who can think no ill of man or God, and in whom religious gladness, being in possession from the outset, needs no deliverance from antecedent burden. So this is pretty interesting, right? He's saying, basically, he hopes that everyone has someone in their life who has this intense happiness, where they have this ability to focus on the good things in life, perhaps, even to a fault, but who's able to truly live in the present and to be grateful. And James connects this with two things that are pretty interesting. He says it's more likely to be a woman, and it's more likely to be a young woman. And as someone who reads reflection papers, I find this very interesting, because I think when I read reflection papers that for in general, right, that women talk about things that are harder, and that they're probably more likely to talk about things that are very difficult than maybe my male students. Although, as I tell you in class, lots of males like even come to office hours and cry and stuff like that, because of course everybody has a lot going on. And then also the sense of like the young being happier. I think it's kind of an interesting, not necessarily stereotype, but caricature. So why does he think that the young are happier? James would probably say, well, they're not wise, therefore they don't know how hard life can actually be. But all of y'all are somewhere between the ages of like 18 and 40, and I'm sure in the time period that you've lived in, you have found that there are some things in life that are really good and easy, and other things that are quite hard. So it's pretty interesting to think that if everyone has a life that that is composed of things that are both good and bad, that bring us happiness and that bring us pain? How do we come to have such different views about the intrinsic goodness or badness of life and of our experiences? Okay. Ooh, yeah. Okay, this one's really good. It's a little controversial. We'll see. He says, in the Romish Church, by which he means the Roman Church, by which he means the Roman Catholic Church, such characters find a more congenial soil to grow in than in Protestantism, whose fashions of feeling have been set by minds of a decidedly pessimistic order. But even in Protestantism, they have been abundant enough, and in its recent liberal developments of Unitarianism and latitudinarianism generally, minds of this order have played and still are playing leading and constructive parts. And then he talks about Emerson, Okay, so what does he mean? Why is he contrasting the Roman Church with the Protestant churches? So you have to remember that Martin Luther was not originally Protestant. He was in fact a Catholic monk, and that when he posted the 95 Theses on the outside of that monastery, he wasn't calling for a break within Catholicism to create Protestantism. He was calling for revisions within the Catholic Church because there were indeed some pretty scary things going on, like the selling of indulgences, and this was happening right in front of Luther's church, as it were. Okay, so Luther is a reformer. He doesn't want to kind of spring off and create this completely different part of Christianity from the kind of Catholic Church. Now, let's take other examples that we would say kind of are emblematic of the difference between being sick soul and being healthy mind. If you've ever been in a Protestant church and then you've been in a Catholic church, you've probably noticed that the Catholic churches is extremely ornate. It's like the chalice is made of gold. The priest and the deacons, they all have these really intense, brightly colored vestments. You've got the stained glass. You usually have like massive bells. You've got the huge organ. Sometimes there are really large choirs. It is certainly elaborate. It is certainly, I guess, to use y'all's language, we would say that it's quite extra. Okay, and then if you go into a Protestant church in general, they tend to be kind of more austere. You know, there's just you have a cross. It's not a crucifix. You've got very minimal decorations. The minister tends to, if he wears robes at all, they tend to be simple colors, probably just black and white, instead of like the bright colored vestments. And by the way, the vestments are really interesting. If you wanted to kind of tap into this and check for yourself, look up priestly vestments in the Catholic Church, and then look them up in the different Orthodox churches, like Russian Orthodox or Coptic Orthodox, because they actually have different colors. And if you're interested in talking about these different kinds of things, it's actually pretty cool to look at. So the colors in the Orthodox and Catholic churches represent liturgical seasons, and within Protestant churches, there are kind of liturgical seasons within some of the denominations, but overall we would say that the kind of focus on sin and overcoming sin every single day, and kind of like what that looks like. So it's not that the Catholic Church doesn't do the same thing. I don't know. How do I draw this distinction more cleanly? I know what it is. There is more structure and more focus on kind of the uplifting parts of life within the older versions of Christianity, which would be Catholic and Orthodox churches, versus within Protestantism. But as James gets at it, these liberal theologians and liberal parts of Protestantism, and Joel Osteen, the guy from Houston, and this idea of like the prosperity gospel, that if you believe in God, if you really put all your effort into believing in Him, and you'll be blessed with good things in life. I mean, that is an immensely healthy-minded perspective on the way life works, right? Just be a good person, and everything that you've ever wanted, you will get. That is very healthy-minded. And so, yeah, that would be the healthy-minded version of the Protestant strand. Then you have the kind of pessimistic version of the Protestant strand, which would be John Calvin. And John Calvin would say, well, some people are saved and some people are damned. And he would say, there's nothing you can do about it. It's fixed. It was fixed at the beginning of time. Before you were created, it was already destined, whether you're going to be saved or you're going to be damned. And, how can you know? You can't know. There you go. That's the extremely pessimistic version of that. Okay. Mm. Okay. Okay. So it says the deliberate adoption of an optimistic turn of mind thus makes its entrance into philosophy. The attitude of unhappiness is not only painful, it is mean and ugly. What can be more base and unworthy than the pining, puling, mumping mood, no matter by what outward ills it may have been engendered? What is more injurious to others? What less helpful out of a way of difficulty? So this is interesting. We've talked about this in class, right? How we all our lives are so intimately interconnected that we can never know how deeply we affect another person's life. And in class, I make the point, and you can see that it's a very healthy-minded point that that because of that, we have an inherent dignity, but also an inherent duty in the way that we treat other people, because we are such profound creatures, and our relations are so profound, and our impact is so profound that to basically say no, you don't have a purpose and that no one will miss you when you're gone is not only a very sad thing to say, but it's fundamentally untrue. Because, and as I often give the example, if you were to go stand in the middle of a hallway when class lets out, people would either run into you or they would go around you. And either way, just the simple fact that you take up space means that you affect the way other people live their lives, and therefore that your life is consequential. Because if you were literally invisible and immaterial, then people could walk right through you. And at that point, it would be harder to say that you have an intense ability to affect the way people live their lives. Of course, when people have to go around you or they bump into you and they stagger backwards or whatever, it's easier to make the argument that your life has purpose. So there you go, healthy-minded philosophy. Okay. All right. That's the last I'm going to say about that, because I want to spend most of the time talking about the sixth soul. Oh yeah, this is really good. Okay, so it says, just as we saw that in healthy-mindedness there are shallower and profounder levels, so also are there different levels of the morbid mind, and the one is much more formidable than the other. There are people for whom evil means only a maladjustment with things, a wrong correspondence of one's life with the environment. Such evil as this is curable, in principle at least, upon the natural plane, for merely by modifying either the self or the things, or both at once, the two terms may be made to fit, and all go merry as marriage bells again. So this is really interesting, right? In the healthy-minded person, since again it's on a spectrum, you would say the optimistic version of the healthy-mindedness that still talks about things being bad basically says what Aristotle says, and that is that every action that we engage in is directed towards some good, right? Anything that we do it because we are pursuing some good. It might not be the good, the thing that is really good, the thing that we actually need, but everything that we do, we are aiming for some kind of good. So even something like where you're acting out, and you would say whatever behavior you did, it's like, oh my gosh, like what was that about? At the end of the day, what you wanted was to be noticed and to be appreciated for who you are. And therefore you were aiming at some good, that good being noticed and appreciated for who you are. Maybe you just went about it in a weird way. That's a very healthy-minded perspective on evil. Okay. All right. So, but then there are others for whom evil is no mere relation of the subject to particular outer things, but something more radical and general, a wrongness or vice in his essential nature, which no alteration of the environment or any superficial rearrangement of the inner self can cure, and which requires a supernatural remedy. On the whole, the Latin races have leaned more towards the former way of looking upon evil, as made up of ills and sins in the plural, removable in detail, while the Germanic races have tended rather to think of sin in the singular with a capital S, as of something ineradicably ingrained in our natural subjectivity and never to be removed by any superficial piecemeal operations. These comparisons of races are always open to exception, but undoubtedly the northern tone in religion has inclined to the more intimately pessimistic persuasion. Okay, this is a really, really interesting point. Now you have to know a little bit of history to understand why James is saying this. So, like I said earlier, Martin Luther is a Catholic monk, but he's a Catholic monk in Germany, and so he's extremely pessimistic. And we'll see some of these quotes from him here in a second that really kind of catch on to that. But he talks about how the Germanic races, by which he means like the Germans and the Danes and the Anglo-Saxons, those peoples, the ones that the Romans considered to be barbarians, those people had a decidedly more pessimistic outlook on life. And if you look at which religions kind of predominated in those places, you would see that they are what we would call very ascetic versions of Protestantism. So after Luther's Reformation, you end up with a number of interesting other denominations in the places that that James is talking about. So you end up with the Huguenots. You end up with the Calvinists. And John Calvin was where's he from? Not Vienna. He was. I think he was Swiss. Anyway, so these places, like basically Germany and kind of like that the northern and northwestern part of Europe, you have those would be the Germanic peoples in James's language, and they have this decidedly more pessimistic turn. And this is really interesting and true even within kind of philosophy. So you think of people like Immanuel Kant, and Kant talking about how the way that the human mind perceives things is by reality conforming to certain categories that already exist in our mind. But Kant says we can never know things in themselves. And basically he says he sees this as a weakness within our nature, within the way that our minds actually operate. Again, it's like there's something wrong with us. Marx certainly thinks that something is wrong with us, but Marx links that to capitalism, right? Saying that human nature has basically been perverted and ruined by capitalism, and that communism will fix that. So Marx kind of eventually teeters out of it, but that's only at the very end of his philosophy. Like what he thinks the very end of everything is this optimistic thing. But everything between that and the very beginning of what he wrote, it's all extremely pessimistic. Okay. So, and then, so that being the big difference there, whether or not human nature is fixable, whether or not evil is simply misaiming, or if evil is like something that is intrinsically there, like something is intrinsically evil. That is the debate that we're talking about here. Okay. Ooh. Here we go. All right. So now here's James, and he's thinking about Luther. He says, what single-handed man was ever on the whole as successful as Luther? Yet when he had grown old, he looked back on his life as if it were an absolute failure. And now here he is quoting Martin Luther. Luther says, I am utterly weary of life. I pray the Lord will come forthwith and carry me hence. Let him come, above all, with his last judgment. I will stretch out my neck, the thunder will burst forth, and I shall be at rest. I mean, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? Martin Luther? I mean, this guy fought the Pope and won. I mean, that is super successful, right? And what he is thinking about is he's like, you know what? This life has been terrible, and I can't wait to stretch out my neck and for God to zap me and for him to swiftly judge me, and so that I can be done, because I'm so over this. It's like those memes that you see, right? It's I can't even is Martin Luther. Okay. All right. So here's James read, like I said, he talks about all these different people. But one person who's really interested in was Tolstoy, and another person was Goethe. But the Tolstoy stuff is, I think, really, really interesting. So he's writing about Tolstoy. James says, Tolstoy relates that he began to have moments of perplexity, of what he calls arrest, as if he knew not how to live or what to do. It is obvious that those were moments in which the excitement and interest which our functions naturally bring had ceased. Life had been enchanting. It was now flat, sober, more than sober, dead. Things were meaningless, whose meaning had always been self-evident. The questions, why and what next, began to beset him more and more frequently. At first, it seemed as if such questions must be answerable, and as if he could easily find the answers if he would take the time. But as they ever became more urgent, he perceived that it was like those first discomforts of a sick man, to which he pays but little attention till they run into one continuous suffering. And then he realizes that what he took for a passing disorder means the most momentous thing in the world for him, means his death. I mean, this is extremely pessimistic stuff here. So he's talking about how Tolstoy, who was famous within his own lifetime, wealthy within his own lifetime, extremely well thought of within his own lifetime, was considered a genius by his contemporaries. I mean, it would be like you turning in a paper and me submitting it to the Nobel Committee, with your name, and you becoming wealthy and famous overnight, and all these people appreciating you, and then you find that the things that used to make you happy no longer make you happy. And that is, of course, one of the symptoms of clinical depression. And that the sense of the goodness of life and the goodness of you and the things that make you happy, all of that begins to kind of spill out or bleed out. And everything just looks gray and dead and uninteresting. But it's even worse than that, because what Tolstoy says after that is really troubling. So this is Tolstoy, quote, "These questions, why, wherefore, what for, found no response. I felt," says Tolstoy, "that something had broken within me, on which my life had always rested, that I had nothing left to hold on to, and that morally my life had stopped. An invincible force impelled me to get rid of my existence in one way or another. It cannot be said exactly that I wished to kill myself, for the force which drew me away from life was fuller, more powerful, more general than any mere desire. It was a force like my old aspiration to live, only it impelled me in the opposite direction. It was an aspiration of my whole being to get out of life." So this is really, really interesting. Now, Freud also picks up on this, and he calls it thanatos, the death instinct. And basically he says that every human being has this nature that's defined by two parts. One part is the erotic or the eros part, which is about unity and creation. And the other part is thanatos, which is the death instinct. And that is the part bent on destruction and eradication, if you want to look at it that way. So Tolstoy, he's depressed. He's unhappy. The things that used to make him happy no longer bring him any joy, no longer bring him any sense of satisfaction. He says his moral life stopped. And when your moral life stops, I think it's safe to say that basically you feel like your actions have no purpose, they have no meaning, and they're not connected to anything, because to act morally is to treat yourself and to treat others in the right way. Okay? So if your life stops morally, what you're really saying is your actions don't affect anyone else, nor do they affect you anymore, nor do they conform to or not conform to some bigger expectation of how your conduct should be. So you're basically it's like you've fallen off a life raft without a life jacket on. You're just kind of floating, bobbing. Yes, Brittany, thank you. Thanatos is also the Greek god of nonviolent death. So it's very interesting, right? That Freud specifically picks that term, and that Tolstoy talks about how he doesn't have a desire to actively take his life, but instead he has this push, this constant pressing behind him that he should not exist anymore. Now, what are some examples that we can think of this? What about when like you have two dogs, for example, and one of the dogs dies, passes away, gets euthanized, whatever. The other dog stops eating, right? They kind of just wither away, and sometimes they pass away not only, if not within the next day, but very soon after. And then of course there are a lot of dogs that get better. We can also think of the same thing with people who are married. Sometimes you lose your spouse or you lose your best friend, and so much of your self-concept and so much of your life and your experiences is built up in this other person, that to lose them is to lose a massive part of yourself. And therefore you don't actively seek to shoot yourself in the head or poison yourself or whatever. Your will to live basically wanes, and as it weakens, something else gets stronger, and that thing that gets stronger is thanatos, this desire to basically just to not exist anymore, to not be anymore, because being is painful. That would be the sick soul argument, that to be is intrinsically to be in a state of desire and to be wanting things and to be pursuing things. And whenever you're doing that, you put yourself in the situation that you might not get them. And to not get the things that you want is, of course, painful. Think about the last time you went to a fast food restaurant, and let's say McDonald's, because I know this happens fairly frequently, and you want a McFlurry. Okay, McFlurry's cheap, right? They run between like $1 and $2.50 for probably the biggest one. And yet, oftentimes when you go to McDonald's, the McFlurry machine is down. So you wanted this thing. Perhaps you went to McDonald's only for the McFlurry. And then when it's not there, you don't just feel like, no big deal. You're like actively disappointed. You're like, ugh. I mean, like, do I even order anything else now? And you probably do. But that's besides the point here. Is this the sense that, because you have a desire, you have an ability to become frustrated. Okay. So yeah, Tolstoy, the desire for life waning and the desire for non-being becoming stronger. Okay. All right. There are some other paragraphs here. I would encourage you to read them. I'm not going to go over them. I'll just say like a couple other things, and we'll wrap it up. So what is the take-home message from this? Why have a lecture on this at all? For a couple of reasons. Oh yeah, this is really important. It's not actually in the text. So James says that everybody, every single person, is either healthy-minded or sick-souled. Everyone. And he says that if you are healthy-minded, truly healthy-minded, you can never become a sick soul. James is like, it's impossible. But he thinks that if you are born a sick soul, you can become healthy-minded. And how do you do this? James says that you have to have a conversion. Okay? And he uses intentionally this religious language, although he doesn't mean that it has to happen religiously, because what happens in any conversion, right? And again, this is we're drawing on the different saints and ascetics and people who are religious and people who are non-religious is so important for his argument. He basically says a conversion is a turn of the heart. In Hebrew, the word is teshiva, this sense of whatever used to grip you, you're free from it, and now your heart is focused on other things. And the sick-souled person, their heart is only is mainly turned towards these things that are negative, the harder parts of life, the sense of despair, the sense of darkness, the sense of alienation, the veils of life, instead of the higher things, the uplifting things. So James says that the sick soul can have a conversion and become healthy-minded. And he thinks that, like I said, healthy-minded people can never become sick-souled. Now, in class, we always talk about this. People get very upset about this. They think that they have elements of being healthy-minded and of being sick-souled. Obviously, we all have days that we're pretty upset, bad days, and we have days that are really, really good days. And James would say, yes, and that doesn't disprove my point. And here's why. He would say your basic personality inclination is towards one or the other. And on top of that, he said at the very beginning, at the outset, that they are both spectrums. So that while, you and your best friend might both be healthy-minded, you could be more in on the scale towards being sick-souled, and they could be even more healthy-minded than you. So that even though you are still healthy-minded, you are also aware, at least kind of fleetingly, of the problems of life. Whereas your friend is like, no, all we have to do is just take care of business, do what we're supposed to do, and we'll end up wealthy, and we'll end up happy, and we'll end up fulfilled. Okay. Can you be both sick-souled and healthy-minded? Yeah, I think I kind of already answered that. So James would say no. He would say that you're either one or the other, but whichever one you are, you would fall somewhere on the spectrum. So more than likely, if you're asking the question, not to put you on the spot, then you're probably a sick-souled. Because you see, a healthy-minded person, when they're asked this, they don't freak out and go, "Oh my God, am I healthy-minded or am I sick-souled?" They're just like, "Oh, that's interesting that there are categories and that there are spectrums. I just try to live in the present and be happy." Okay. Yeah. Okay. So the other question, take a healthy-minded person, say something drastic happens to them. Maybe it's something horribly violent. Can't they turn into a sick soul? James still says no. And I know that's an unsatisfactory answer for our modern ears. But James, he is extremely consistent in this, and I kind of respect this in a way. I know it's frustrating, but here's why. He would say that the healthy-minded person, the way that they approach the world is like I said earlier. It's this sense of, here are the good things in my life. Here are the good things in my past. Here are the good things that I hope to achieve. Here's my present. I'm focused on what's currently going on. So it's not that bad things can't happen to them. It's that healthy-minded people have it so that, or they don't have it, but their perception of events in life is like whatever evil befalls them, they can overcome it, right? That it doesn't define them, if that makes sense. Whereas for sick soul, if you're sick souled and something bad happens to you, it's like this is another instance of the evil within the world, another instance of nobody cares for me, no one protects me, no one looks out for me, that kind of stuff. So yeah, like I said, in class we would have a very big discussion about this. Several of y'all would get quite outraged and say, of course, I'm not just a sick soul. I'm healthy-minded some of the time. And I would just say, I understand. I agree with you. I have good days and bad days, just like everyone else. But I'm not here to simply debate these ideas with you. I am here to tell you what James said, and I'm also trying to say why he argued the things that he did. So here's another thing. Remember, I told you him and his dad both had these like really intense visionary experiences at around the same age. Perhaps James made the argument that if you were sick-souled and you became healthy-minded, you could never go back because that's what he wanted for himself. That's one thing. That's one option. Another thing is he might say, well, if you're sick-souled, if you're healthy-minded, then you never undertake life in the same depth of pain that the sick soul does. Maybe that was him hoping that had he only been different, right, in terms of his personality inclination, that his life would not have been filled with so much suffering. And remember, William James got a doctorate degree in medicine from Harvard, and they basically were like, look, we'll give you the degree, but promise us you will never practice medicine. So just imagine going to Harvard and getting an MD and then being told basically like, here's your degree, but it's not worth anything. And there was a reason they didn't want him to practice medicine. It's not because he wasn't smart enough to do it, but it was because like the things that he focused on and the reputation that he had for the kinds of things that he talked about and studied, Harvard didn't really feel like maybe they wanted that attached to their name. Yeah, there are more questions here. Don't agree. Some people agree. Some people don't agree. So what can I really say? Yeah, I mean, I think the easiest thing to say is James was wrong. If you're healthy-minded, you can become sick-souled. And if you're sick-souled, you can become healthy-minded, because there are no hard and fast barriers between the way that you look at the world. In fact, the things that happen to us and also the way that we think about things, the way that we come to understand ourselves, the experiences that we have, all of those things together can radically change our perspective, can radically influence what things we think are important. And when that happens, we can become healthy-minded or sick-souled. And let's just take a very extreme example to illustrate this. Perhaps we're an alcoholic. Okay, and if we're an alcoholic, then the thing that we are most interested in is getting drunk, because being drunk means not being in pain, means whatever emptiness and suffering that we feel, that we momentarily forget it, that we momentarily are detached from the pain that we have brought upon ourselves and that we bring upon other people. It's an escape. And so that is that could be your mindset. And then the argument for Alcoholics Anonymous is basically that you become part of a community, that the community makes you admit that there's a power greater than yourself. Okay, I gotta go. because it is 1 o'clock and it's my wife's turn to do her online stuff. So I'm gonna cut it short here. I'm sorry. Thank y'all for your attention today. If you got any questions about this, you want to debate it, feel free to put it in the reflection paper or send me an email. We can talk about it over email. So have a good day, everyone. See ya.